For months, the Imperial Japanese Navy had searched for explanations. How could an enemy considered slow, disorganized, and predictable appear in exactly the right place at the precise moment? How could surgical strikes, impossible ambushes, and almost supernatural precision be explained? The answer was there, hidden in messages crossing the Pacific every hour, but no one wanted to see it. Until one day, an American intelligence message, an insignificant phrase about water shortages on a remote island, triggered every alarm. Because the Americans responded to that false message. They responded as if they had read it. And that was the moment when Japanese High Command understood, with a silence heavier than any naval defeat, that their codes, their security, and their strategic advantage had vanished forever. The power of JN-25. In the spring of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy operated under a certainty that bordered on religious faith. Their naval communications were impenetrable. The encryption system known to American cryptanalysts as JN-25 represented the pinnacle of Japanese cryptographic achievement. The code was not simple. It consisted of approximately 45,000 five-digit numbers, each representing words, phrases, or letters. These numbers were then further obscured by adding them to values from codebooks containing another 30,000 random number groups. The result was a double-layer encryption that Japanese naval officers believed would resist any attempt at penetration. Every few months, the Japanese Navy changed either the codebook, the additive tables, or both. This practice, they reasoned, would render any partial progress by enemy cryptanalysts worthless. Even if an opponent managed to identify patterns in one version, the next iteration would erase that advantage entirely. The mathematical complexity alone seemed prohibitive. Without the codebooks, physical documents kept under strict security aboard Japanese vessels and at naval headquarters, decryption appeared impossible. And without knowing both the original five-digit code and the additive applied to it, an intercepted message would remain nothing more than meaningless numbers. Japanese doctrine reflected this confidence. Communications flowed freely across vast Pacific distances, coordinating fleet movements, supply operations, and strategic planning. Officers transmitted orders with the assurance that enemy ears, even if listening, could hear nothing but noise.
Early Japanese successes. The months following Pearl Harbor seemed to validate every assumption about Japanese superiority. The surprise attack on December 7, 1941, had been coordinated through encrypted communications that the Americans failed to anticipate. Strike forces had assembled, moved into position, and executed their mission while American intelligence remained blind to the approaching threat. In the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, Japanese forces advanced with devastating speed. The coordination of naval, air, and ground operations demonstrated not just tactical excellence, but secure communications that allowed complex, multi-pronged attacks to unfold simultaneously across thousands of miles. When the British battleship HMS Prince of Wales and battlecruiser HMS Repulse were sunk off Malaya in December 1941, Japanese naval aviation had located and destroyed them with precision that suggested complete operational security. The British had expected Japanese reconnaissance to be limited. Instead, they faced coordinated attacks that indicated seamless information flow through Japanese command structures. By early 1942, the Empire of Japan controlled territory stretching from the borders of India to the Central Pacific, from the Aleutian Islands to the approaches of Australia. Every conquest had been planned, coordinated, and executed through communications that Japanese intelligence officers assured the High Command remained secure. Staff officers in Tokyo reviewed reports from across the new empire with satisfaction. Not a single indication existed that enemy forces had penetrated Japanese naval communications. The Americans, reeling from Pearl Harbor and struggling to establish defensive positions, appeared to be reacting rather than anticipating.
The first ignored signals. Yet even in those early months, subtle anomalies began to surface. Anomalies that would later seem obvious, but at the time were easily dismissed or explained away. In January 1942, a Japanese submarine patrol in the Central Pacific encountered American destroyers in a location that seemed oddly specific. The destroyers were positioned exactly along the submarine's planned route, almost as if waiting. The encounter was logged, the submarine escaped, and the incident was attributed to American luck or perhaps improved patrol patterns. A month later, during operations near New Guinea, Japanese naval forces found American reconnaissance aircraft in positions that allowed them maximum observation with minimum risk. The aircraft appeared, took photographs, and departed before Japanese fighters could intercept. Again, the incident was noted. Again, it was explained as coincidence or improved American tactics learned from early defeats. In March, a Japanese supply convoy bound for Rabaul altered course to avoid what intelligence reports suggested might be American submarine activity. The convoy followed its new route successfully, but encountered American submarines along that route as well. The submarines attacked, sank one transport, and disappeared. How had they known about the course change? One intelligence officer in the Combined Fleet Headquarters reviewing these reports made a notation in his daily log: "Too much coincidence." But the observation went no further. Japanese successes continued to outweigh these small mysteries. The decisive battles were still being won. American resistance, while stiffening, remained reactive. Moreover, to suggest that JN-25 had been compromised would have required explaining how such a thing would be possible. The code's complexity, its frequent changes, the absence of captured codebooks, all of these factors argued against any possibility of systematic decryption. The coincidences had to be exactly that. Coincidences, perhaps aided by American improvements in direction finding or acoustic detection of ships. But in a basement office complex beneath the Iolani Palace in Honolulu, another story was unfolding. There, in a facility known as Station HYPO, dozens of American cryptanalysts were working around the clock, and the impossible was becoming possible.
Station HYPO. The basement space that housed Station HYPO bore no resemblance to the grand headquarters from which Japanese admirals directed their fleets. The room was cramped, poorly ventilated, and lit by harsh fluorescent tubes that cast shadows across tables covered in papers, worksheets, and partially completed matrices of numbers. Commander Joseph Rochefort led the operation, often working 20-hour days, sleeping on a cot in a corner when exhaustion became overwhelming. Around him, a team of cryptanalysts, linguists, and IBM machine operators attacked JN-25 with systematic determination. The work was painstaking. Each intercepted message was a string of 5-digit numbers. Without the codebooks, these numbers were meaningless. But cryptanalysis doesn't require having the key. It requires finding patterns, exploiting repetitions, and leveraging mistakes. The team began with frequency analysis. Certain 5-digit groups appeared more often than others. Some numbers showed up consistently at the beginnings of messages. Others clustered at the ends. These patterns suggested standardized message formats: greetings, signatures, classifications. When Japanese operators made errors, transmitting a message twice with different additives, or sending a corrected version of a garbled transmission, they provided cryptanalysts with what were called depths. Two messages encoded with the same additive created a mathematical relationship that could be exploited to strip away the encryption layer. The IBM tabulating machines, originally designed for census work, were repurposed to process thousands of possible number combinations. Analysts would run calculations through the machines, looking for groups that, when subtracted from encrypted messages, produced results that matched known Japanese language patterns. Progress came in fragments. By February 1942, HYPO could read perhaps 10 to 15% of intercepted messages. A message might reveal a date, or a grid coordinate, or a reference to a ship name, but surrounded by undecipherable portions that left the overall meaning unclear. But 15% was enough to begin sketching the outline of Japanese operations. A reference to Carrier Division 5 in one message could be correlated with direction-finding bearings showing radio transmissions from that location. A date mentioned in another intercept could be matched against observed ship movements. Slowly, piece by piece, the intelligence picture developed. By April 1942, as the Japanese Navy prepared for operations in the Coral Sea, HYPO's read percentage had climbed above 20%. The fragments were becoming sentences. The sentences were revealing intentions.
Battles that should not have been lost. The Battle of the Coral Sea in early May 1942 marked the first time American carriers confronted Japanese carriers in combat. Both sides sustained losses. The USS Lexington was sunk, the Japanese light carrier Shoho destroyed, and the fleet carrier Shokaku damaged. But from a Japanese perspective, something about the battle felt wrong. American carriers had been positioned with troubling accuracy. When Japanese strike aircraft reached the location where American carriers should have been based on reconnaissance reports, they found the carriers had moved, but not far. The Americans seemed to be anticipating Japanese intentions without responding to direct observation. Rear Admiral Takeo Tagaki, commanding the Japanese carrier force, noted in his after-action report that American movements suggested awareness of our operational planning beyond what reconnaissance alone would provide. The phrasing was careful, almost tentative, to suggest more explicitly that communication security had failed would have been a serious accusation requiring serious evidence. Back in Tokyo, staff officers reviewed the Coral Sea results with mixed feelings. The operation had achieved its immediate objective, preventing American interference with the Port Moresby invasion, but at a higher cost than anticipated. More concerning was that American forces had been present in strength at a time and place that should have allowed for Japanese surprise. In the weeks following Coral Sea, Japanese intelligence officers conducted a review of communication security. They examined transmission logs, checked codebook distribution, and interviewed communications officers. Every physical security measure appeared intact. No codebooks had been lost. Transmission protocols had been followed.
The regular code changes had occurred on schedule. The conclusion, documented in a May 20, 1942 intelligence assessment, stated, "No evidence exists of enemy penetration of JN-25. Observed American carrier positioning likely resulted from enhanced reconnaissance capabilities and improved tactical judgment following initial defeats." The assessment was logical, methodical, and completely wrong.
Growing paranoia. Yet doubt, once introduced, is difficult to eliminate entirely. In the offices of the Combined Fleet Intelligence Section, conversations began to occur in low voices, away from formal channels. One officer pointed out that American submarines had been appearing with increasing frequency along Japanese convoy routes, not just major shipping lanes where their presence might be expected, but along secondary routes used when intelligence suggested heavier Allied submarine activity on primary routes. Another noted that American radio call signs seemed to track Japanese fleet units with unusual accuracy. Direction finding could locate a transmitter, but American forces seemed to know not just where Japanese ships were, but which specific ships were in which locations. A commander specializing in communications security proposed a drastic measure: a complete replacement of JN-25 ahead of schedule, implementing a new code structure with different organizational principles. The proposal was reviewed and rejected. The reasoning was practical. Creating an entirely new code system would take months, disrupt operations across the Pacific, and, according to cryptographic experts, provide no additional security if the current system's physical security remained intact. Furthermore, the spring of 1942 brought planning for the most ambitious operation yet conceived by the Imperial Japanese Navy, the assault on Midway Atoll. The operation would draw the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle and eliminate them, securing Japanese dominance in the Pacific for years to come. Changing the entire communications system in the midst of planning such an operation seemed reckless. Thousands of messages would need to be transmitted, coordinating the movements of over 200 ships, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of personnel across multiple fleet elements converging from different directions. A communications failure during such an operation could be catastrophic. So the decision was made to proceed with the existing system, with one modification: a new version of JN-25, designated JN-25B, would be introduced on May 27, 1942, just days before the Midway operation commenced. This would provide updated additive tables and some code group changes while maintaining the system's fundamental structure. It was a compromise between security and operational necessity. It was also too little, too late.
The Island Without Water. By May 1942, Station HYPO's cryptanalysts had achieved reading percentages above 40% on many messages. The introduction of JN-25B on May 27th created a temporary setback, but the fundamental code structure remained similar enough that analysts could rebuild their decryption matrices within days rather than months. More importantly, the traffic analysis and patterns established over previous months provided context. When the new version appeared, HYPO already knew roughly what the messages were about. They just needed to recover the specific details. Throughout May, intercepted messages had referenced a major operation.
The target was indicated by a two-letter designator, AF. The messages discussed fleet concentrations, carrier assignments, troop numbers, and timing, all centered on operations against AF. Commander Rochefort and his team believed AF designated Midway Atoll, a small American outpost in the Central Pacific. The location made strategic sense. Midway represented the westernmost American defensive position, and its capture would provide Japan with an advanced base for operations against Hawaii. Moreover, direction-finding bearings on Japanese transmissions suggested fleet elements were positioning themselves northwest of Midway's location. But belief and certainty are different things. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, needed definitive proof before committing his limited carrier forces to what might be a trap. If AF was not Midway, if it was perhaps the Aleutians or Hawaii itself, then positioning carriers at Midway would leave other areas vulnerable. Rochefort proposed a solution: make the Japanese tell them.
The trap. On May 20th, 1942, naval communications personnel on Midway Atoll transmitted a message in a low-level code known to be readable by Japanese intelligence. The message stated that Midway's water distillation plant had suffered a breakdown and the atoll was experiencing fresh water shortages. The message was mundane, bureaucratic, exactly the sort of minor logistical complaint that would be transmitted for administrative purposes. It was also completely fabricated. Midway's water supply was functioning normally. The transmission was sent, and then Station HYPO waited. 2 days later, on May 22, an intercepted Japanese message encrypted in JN25B contained a reference that, when decrypted, read, "AF is short of water." The message had been transmitted from Tokyo to fleet units in the Marshall Islands, apparently passing along intelligence gathered from intercepted American communications. The Japanese had taken the bait, read it, believed it, and then retransmitted it in their encrypted communications. When Commander Rochefort saw the decrypted message, he immediately notified Admiral Nimitz. The proof was irrefutable. AF was Midway. The Japanese were planning a major assault, and more importantly, though this implication remained unspoken in official channels, the Japanese had just confirmed they had no idea their most secure naval code was being read.
Irrefutable confirmation. The water shortage message was not the only piece of the puzzle, but it was the keystone that locked everything else into place. Over the following days, Station HYPO extracted an increasingly detailed picture of Japanese intentions. 4 Japanese fleet carriers would approach Midway from the northwest. The attack on Midway would occur on June 4. A separate invasion force would approach from the west. An additional force would create a diversion in the Aleutians to draw American attention northward. The operation's ultimate goal was to destroy the American carriers expected to respond to the Midway attack. Admiral Nimitz now possessed information that transformed the strategic equation. Instead of reacting to a Japanese surprise attack, American forces could prepare an ambush of their own. The 3 available American carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown, were ordered to positions northeast of Midway, where they would be positioned to attack the Japanese carriers while remaining undetected. But while American preparations proceeded with urgent efficiency, the Japanese remained unaware that their entire operational plan had been compromised. Messages continued to flow through JN-25B, discussing fleet movements, aircraft assignments, and tactical coordination. Each message was intercepted, decrypted, and added to the American intelligence picture. In Tokyo, in the days before the Midway operation commenced, naval intelligence officers reviewed their final security assessments. Everything appeared in order. Code changes had been implemented. Communications protocols were being followed. No evidence suggested American awareness of Japanese intentions beyond what might be deduced from obvious preparations. On June 2, 1942, the Japanese carrier strike force, under the command of Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, approached Midway from the northwest. The four carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, represented the most powerful concentration of naval aviation in the Pacific. Their aircraft had struck Pearl Harbor, devastated Allied forces across Southeast Asia, and dominated every naval engagement since the war began. The officers aboard those ships proceeded with confidence that their approach remained undetected, their intentions unknown. The reality was quite different.
The Japanese realization. The Battle of Midway began on June 4, 1942, and by the end of that day, the four Japanese carriers lay sinking or burning hulks. The defeat was absolute, unexpected, and strategically catastrophic. In one day, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost carrier aviation strength it would never recover. But the full horror of the situation became apparent only in the weeks that followed, as intelligence officers in Tokyo began piecing together what had happened. American carriers had been positioned with impossible accuracy. They had been waiting northeast of Midway, exactly where they needed to be to intercept the Japanese carrier force after its attack on the atoll. The timing of American strikes suggested they had known when Japanese carriers would be most vulnerable, with their decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. Captured American documents from Midway, recovered after the battle, contained information that could only have come from penetration of Japanese communications. The Americans had known the composition of the Japanese task force, the planned timing of attacks, even the designation of specific fleet units. On June 15, 1942, a meeting was convened at the Navy Ministry in Tokyo. Present were senior intelligence officers, communications specialists, and representatives from the Naval General Staff. The topic was communications security. The conclusion was unavoidable. The minutes of that meeting, later discovered in post-war archives, record the assessment with bureaucratic precision. Analysis of enemy actions at Midway indicates comprehension of operational details that cannot be explained by reconnaissance, direction finding, or tactical inference. The most probable explanation is enemy reading of enciphered communications. The phrase "most probable explanation" represented a careful understatement of what everyone in the room knew with certainty. The Americans had broken JN-25. They had been reading Japanese naval communications for months. Every operation, every fleet movement, every strategic discussion transmitted by radio had been compromised. The implications spread outward in concentric circles of disaster. Coral Sea had not been an unlucky encounter. The Americans had known Japanese carriers were coming. The submarine ambushes were not coincidences. American submarines had been directed to interception points based on decrypted movement orders. The seemingly improved American reconnaissance was not improved at all.
It was intelligence derived from reading Japanese messages about their own reconnaissance findings. One officer, speaking in the meeting, stated what others were thinking. This means they have been listening to us for months. Every message, every operational plan, every fleet assignment.
Midway as consequence. Understanding how thoroughly communications had been compromised gave the Battle of Midway new and terrible meaning. The defeat had not resulted from tactical errors or bad luck. It had resulted from fighting an enemy who knew every element of the Japanese plan, while the Japanese knew nothing of American preparations. Admiral Nagumo had approached Midway believing his force was undetected. American carriers had been waiting. When Japanese scout planes failed to locate the American carriers immediately, Nagumo had ordered his reserve aircraft, armed with torpedoes for anti-ship strikes, to be rearmed with bombs for a second attack on Midway. The Americans had struck during that rearming process, when Japanese carriers were at their most vulnerable, almost as if they had known that moment would come. The loss of 4 carriers represented more than ships. It represented the trained aircrews who had attacked Pearl Harbor, the maintenance personnel who kept aircraft operational, the tactical coordinators who managed deck operations. These were irreplaceable assets developed over years of intensive training. But worse than the material losses was the psychological impact. The Imperial Japanese Navy had operated throughout its history with confidence in its tactical and technological superiority. That confidence now lay in ruins, replaced by the knowledge that every message, every plan, every operational intention had been transparent to the enemy. In July 1942, a new code system, JN-25C, was implemented with more extensive changes than previous versions. But the damage was done. Station HYPO and other American cryptanalytic units had established their methods, their analytical frameworks, their understanding of Japanese naval communications patterns. Breaking each new version became progressively faster. The silent battle. The final irony of the JN-25 story is that the Japanese never publicly acknowledged the extent of the compromise. To do so would have been to admit a failure so fundamental it might have undermined confidence in the entire naval command structure. Moreover, the Americans gave them no reason to believe a public acknowledgement was necessary. American forces continued to act in ways that could be attributed to good intelligence rather than code-breaking specifically. Throughout the remaining years of the war, Japanese naval communications continued to be read by American cryptanalysts. New code systems were introduced, and each was eventually broken. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944, where Japanese carrier aviation was decisively defeated, was another engagement shaped by American foreknowledge of Japanese intentions derived from signals intelligence. When the war ended in August 1945, the full scope of Allied code-breaking efforts remained classified. The Japanese learned comprehensively about American cryptanalytic successes only years later, when historical research and declassified documents revealed how thoroughly their communications had been compromised. But in that conference room in Tokyo in June 1942, when officers reviewed the evidence and reached their conclusion about JN-25, the essential truth was already understood. The war in the Pacific would be decided not just by carriers and aircraft, but by mathematics, linguistics, and the silent work of analysts hunched over worksheets in basement offices. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost a battle it never knew was being fought, and by the time they realized what had happened,
The strategic initiative had passed to an enemy who could read their every word.
The code-breaking campaign against JN-25 represents one of history's most consequential intelligence operations. The victory at Midway, enabled by decrypted communications, represented the turning point of the Pacific War. But the broader significance lies in demonstrating that modern warfare extends beyond visible battlefields into invisible domains of information, encryption, and intelligence. The Japanese officers who realized their codes had been broken faced a truth that military commanders throughout history have struggled with: superiority in conventional domains. Ships, aircraft, trained personnel can be negated by superiority in intelligence. The finest operational plans become liabilities when the enemy can read them. The most capable forces can be ambushed when their movements are known in advance. In a basement in Honolulu, working with primitive computers and stubborn determination, American cryptanalysts won a battle that changed history. It was fought without weapons, without violence, in silence and secrecy, but its consequences echoed across the Pacific, in burning carriers, shifted strategies, and a war that took a dramatically different course because of words that were no longer secret. The day the Imperial Japanese Navy understood their codes had been broken was the day they understood the war they thought they were fighting was not the war they were actually losing.